Okay, thanks everybody for coming today. I'd just like to introduce the session. So this is the Inclusive Trinity Awareness Training Series. This is Disability Awareness in Higher Education for Academic and Service Staff. It's the second session of our series. The first one was our Trans and Non-Binary Awareness Training. The video to that is available on our website. And our next session on the March 27th is Inclusive Language from 4 to 5 p.m. here in the Global Room, and you can register for that session also on our website. There will be a recording of this session today too available on our website in due course. And now I'd just like to hand you over to the Disability Officer Jen O'Connor to run today's session. So thanks everybody.
Perfect, thanks John. Okay. We'll just get started. Thank you guys so much for being here. My name is Jen. I work in the disability service as a disability officer. I also work primarily with third and fourth year students who are embracing, I suppose, that transition out of college and what it means to access the workplace when you're disabled. So my role is pretty varied, and a lot of the slides today that we're going to touch on, I probably won't read them specifically. I'll just kind of bounce around ideas through them. What we're mainly aiming to do here is to look at what we have learned as staff in the disability service from our students and what they have told us and what they would like communicated. So we'll get started. So just to introduce myself a little bit more, I am a disabled person. I actually used college services pretty much throughout the entirety of my degree, and absolutely would not have finished my degree if I hadn't. I'm autistic, I have ADHD. My chronic illness that deeply affects my life was actually late diagnosed, so I didn't have any diagnosis throughout college to access support, but that didn't matter. I was met with a huge degree of support, and that's something we generally try to underpin with our students, that if they're struggling in any capacity, they can reach out to us. They don't need to have medical evidence there and then. So I always like to raise that to staff as well, that they can always suggest that and kind of prompt them to reach out to us for whatever reason they might be struggling. So looking at what we're going to talk about today essentially what we're going to be doing is raising awareness around disability. That kind of sounds like a bit of a catch-all because it is. It's more bringing disability, I suppose, into the conversation, making sure it's something that we can look at within the context of academic practices, accessing services. It will surely impact how you as staff interact with different students. Perhaps you meet students that are distressed. I imagine this time of year it's very stressful. When you have the context of disability on top of that, it can be a very difficult road to navigate. So it's something that we're going to focus on today, and that's why we have the final point here, which would be intersectionality, which is looking at, I suppose, the more complex lives our students lead, which they do, like all of us. They're all much more than students. So that is what we're going to focus on today, and we're going to look at that through the lens of stereotypes, stigma, things like that, access and accessibility, and some language use as well. These are themes that we didn't come up with ourselves. These are themes that our students came up with, and the students themselves told us that these are the areas they would like really raised if we ever got the opportunity. So thankfully we do today. Okay, so the history, I suppose, of why we discuss disabilities the way we do, which is essentially in a deficit-based way, comes from our historic use of the medical model. You know it yourself, if you were to go to the doctor and be diagnosed with something, it's never told within a positive lens. I know it myself, when I received my autism diagnosis, it was handed to me almost like a terminal diagnosis, and with an apology attached. And that meant that really impacted how I absorbed that information. In the disability service and in Trinity generally, what we try to do is actually look at, I suppose, who someone is due to their culture, due to where they live, due to who their friends are. Just look at it overall and see who everyone is when they interact with their entire life as one. So we call that the biopsychosocial model. It's something that we're trying to bring in, I suppose, to all of our conversations with students when they reach out to us. When we meet them, the first thing we ask them is to tell tell us a little bit about their lives. What are their friends outside of college? Do they have a culture that's really important to them? Is there a language they prefer to use? All of these different areas that impact your confidence when advocating for yourself in relation to disability. So our students, we have about 2,500 students registered with the Disability Service. We have a lot of students that are very active consistently, and that come back because they need consistent support, maybe potentially at the same times every year. You know, there's always those peaks and troughs. But the one thing that is kind of always raised to us is if we have a student who comes in for a needs assessment or a check-in, and potentially they're presenting with a mental health condition, depression, for example, we never can just talk about depression, because actually it's entirely influenced by the rest of their lives and the rest of their identities. This isn't about, I suppose, putting someone's identities into boxes and categories, but actually looking at a whole picture rather than zooming in, I guess, on a corner frame of a portrait and seeing who somebody is. It doesn't mean we get it right all the time. Sometimes I don't know the right way to acknowledge someone's gender identity, to ask those things. But when we meet our students halfway and we meet them with good faith and give them the opportunity to express themselves how they want and educate us if they're willing to, it's absolutely so impactful for our conversations. And those students do come back and those students do have better academic outcomes. So it's something that we're constantly trying to use. And as service staff and academic staff, I know you're meeting students in all contexts, at the highest stress, also the happiest moments when they've done well in something, also when they're coming to service desks and they're asking for things, they're potentially distressed or a little bit impatient. What we're going to do today essentially is just zoom out as to why someone is presenting the way they're presenting. That's really it and what we want people to consider. So our students do give us constant feedback, I suppose, on how their disabilities are received around Trinity. I know myself, having a physical disability as well as being autistic, they're kind of treated very differently and received very differently in different settings, which isn't that surprising, I suppose. For example, a lot of our students who present with mental health conditions definitely do tend to have a bit more of a struggle accessing accommodations than someone who presents with physical disability that is visible as well. So there is kind of almost a hierarchy. It's not intentional, it's not something we do, but it is something that I think we have all learnt. However, within the disability service, what we prioritise pretty much more than anything is looking at equity of disabilities. We trust that someone coming to us is telling us their experience and that no one will know more than them. That can actually be pretty life-altering, to be honest, when someone gives you the space and trusts you to present yourself and doesn't question, doesn't doubt. It's absolutely massively impactful. It's meant a lot to me, even in different workplaces, when I have said, you know, that I might need this accommodation, for example, and I have been met with complete acceptance in the first round. That has impacted how I've carried out the rest of that role for my duration in a role. So it does impact our students. It also impacts their willingness to ask for help. And this is something that we are constantly working with, which is, I suppose, crisis management around the students, particularly, you know, this time of year, things are a lot. And we work closely with student counselling, S2S, the health centre, to get students the help they need. But generally, we really rely on the students feeling like they can reach out to us, which means how we absorb the information they give us about their disabilities impacts directly their lives and their well-being. It's very tangible. So if a student is coming to you with a disability, they may be expressing, I'm struggling with X, Y, and Z because of this. It takes a phenomenal amount of courage to explain and put yourself on the line. It's usually a little bit exhausting as well. I would just take a moment and step back and remember that it's not on us as people receiving the information to make a judgment or a value-based judgment on their disability. Instead, we have to trust in good faith, and that's how we do things. Okay, so looking at our stereotypes and our myths, we have actually a lot of different students with the same disabilities, which I suppose is not really surprising. particularly when we look at neurodiversity or certain physical conditions. Those students do tell us quite often that they are very much, I suppose, almost at prey to someone's last interaction with someone with their disability, because that's your association with it. I know, for example, like when I told my nan that I was autistic, she was entirely reliant on whoever she had heard on Radio Kerry. And that was, you know, and that's completely valid. But that person on Radio Kerry was talking about their 5-year-old son. Very different experience to me. So instead, I felt like I had to reframe it, which I did, and that was fine. But it is something to be aware of, that if you meet one person with one kind of disability, that's it. It's one person, bottom line. Usually, what I find really helpful with the students is to ask them, what would you like me to know about your disability? Is there anything you would like to share? I usually give them an opportunity to maybe go away and think about it. They don't have to have the answers right there on the spot, but it's good to open it up. The students as well do ask us to let people know that their communication is so dependent on the day they've had. So I suppose whether it is a huge degree of stress that has led someone to get into campus that day, whether it was the Lewis was busy, the Dart, they generally, I suppose, can go, some students experience being nonverbal, some students experience needing to communicate via communication aids, and then they could go weeks not needing that. So I suppose it is, once again, just to know that students communicate differently on different days due to different factors. And just because someone isn't consistently showing up, for example, as a wheelchair user, they might use a wheelchair some days and not other days. The days they don't need it doesn't make the existence of their disability less valid. Once again, we just have to step back and say, that's not for me to decide. It's really that simple, to be honest. So our highest cohort of students that come in are neurodivergent students. ADHD in particular has kind of gone through the roof of students that have registered with us, which makes perfect sense when you see kind of, I suppose, the dialogue culturally around these diagnoses being more accessible, awareness is there. But simultaneously, we have had students who have been met with from academic staff, service staff alike, and sometimes their own families. This notion that I suppose these conditions are overdiagnosed, that everyone is ADHD these days, everyone's a bit autistic, those kind of ideas. And those students generally feel a huge degree of dismissal, but also they have sat through generally an extensive diagnostic process that is quite grueling, emotionally, financially it's grueling as well. It's a tough experience. So once again, it is on us to step back and say, we don't get to question validity. We don't get to question severity. It also eases the situation for us. It really does. If we step back and say, my role here is not as judger, it's as listener. It means you hear. So our students as well, generally, some of them, it doesn't happen too much, thankfully, but some students do say that they feel that sometimes less is expected of them because of their disability in their coursework or in their communication when they come to a desk. If they're, for example, wearing a sunflower lanyard, or maybe their disability is visible in another way, but actually they would like to be considered the same as their non-disabled counterparts. And to remove that assumption, really. It is, I think, coming from a pretty good place when someone is, I suppose, trying to make things easier for the person, but in reality, it has a more negative long-term emotional effect, I think. Okay, so this is something I love talking about, but I hate it at the same time, is we hear from students, and we hear this ourselves, particularly from academic staff, and this isn't to say that academic staff are not up against it. They are. We talk about this time of year being stressful for students. It's phenomenally stressful for the staff, and we know that. But it does mean when we are reaching out about implementing reasonable accommodations that someone has accessed, we do hear different kind of responses that are entirely, once again, born on that academic staff member's stress, what's led them there that day, all of that. And one of it is that the very genuine and often quite well-intentioned belief that by giving someone a lot of reasonable accommodations, a lot, whatever that might mean, is that they are doing the student a disservice. How will they cope in the real world is the big one we get. I'm just trying to show them what the real world's like. I think it's actually unfair to the non-disabled students. These kind of ideas come up, and they're very genuine ideas that are born from a lifetime of experience through that person's lens. But it's important for us to, I suppose, remind that staff member about the difference between equality and equity, which is massive. I have a little cousin who's autistic, and he can, I suppose, have different kind of behavioural challenges. He's only 6, but he was recommended to go into an autism class where he would have an SNA, kind of more time, all of that. My aunt initially wasn't sure. She really wasn't sure if that was going to be best, because she thought, well, he's going to be othered, really. He's going to be isolated, isn't he? And then what if he doesn't get the same education? Because he's exceptionally bright. But in reality, an equal experience would be putting my cousin in a mainstream class and saying sink or swim, because everyone would be experiencing and absorbing the same information. But an equitable experience would be providing specifically for his needs within an education system. So that's where we kind of come from when we look at our reasonable accommodations, is what are their specific needs. For example, we have a lot of students that might need to use different kind of venues for exams. And this kind of has a knock-on effect when they go to service desks, and they might need time in respite rooms in between talking. And for a student to use, say, an individual venue for whatever reason, they might need a scribe, might be a lot of different reasons. A lot of different lecturers can feel that that isn't fair to the students who have to take it maybe in the hall in the RDS, which sounds like my idea of hell. But in terms of that person to complete their exam to a reasonable standard, to the standard that is the same chance as everyone else, needs that absolute silence of that individual room. It's not a get ahead, it's a bare minimum. And once again, I suppose the main point of all of this is for us to just step back and say it's not for us to decide. The students do come to us, and we do a pretty extensive needs assessment process where we talk through their needs. No one receives an accommodation they don't need. And if they do, their biggest fear is being questioned on it. Their biggest fear is being asked why. And that, I think, comes from a huge degree of intimidation. And at the end of the day, the majority of these students, they're young. They're really, really young. And it's so hard to talk to staff who you feel are already an authority, but also an authority in an academic sense, or almost seen as a barrier to accessing a service. It can be really, really daunting. Even though we ourselves, as service providers, I know we don't view ourselves that way, but we see it ourselves when we have students who delay signing up for the disability service until their 3rd or 4th year. We're always thinking, gosh, how can we reach out? How could we have gotten through to them? So once again, it's just for us to notice, what does this student need to complete their education to the standard that they would ordinarily achieve if they didn't have a disability. And a lot of the time that can look like having a lot of supports. That's the bare minimum, no matter how it looks. Okay, so in terms of considerations, these are just things our students just ask us to raise awareness of and kind of just touch on. This one, for example, is that idea that students do find staff intimidating. It's, I suppose, part and parcel of it, particularly the first years, absolutely unsurprising. But they do find staff very, very intimidating, particularly academic staff, because they have this perception that, well, if I talk about my disability, I might get penalised in an exam or assignment later on. That isn't the case. Our academic staff are fantastic at learning or reaching out to us to ask, what's the best way to do this? But from a student's point of view, when you've received such a degree of rejection in life in many different areas, especially if your diagnosis has come later, for example, you kind of almost start life in a fear-based way. You're going to assume the worst just so that you can be braced already. A lot of our students, a huge proportion, have more than one disability and have generally more than one condition happening. Sometimes these conditions are polar opposites of each other. They're exceptionally different. And those students sometimes present to us only talking about one disability, and then in the process we learn that there's maybe another condition, and when we ask them why they didn't mention that on their sign-up form, they're afraid of seeming like they have too much going on, or they're just asking for a lot, or they're going to be seen as attention-seeking. It's a big one. Our students ask us, I suppose, to tell people what it takes to get someone into college that day. And we're going to talk about that a bit later on, about what it leads for someone to stand in front of a service desk and ask for help, and what has happened in the context of their life. We all interact with so many people. I know it can be so exhausting to stop and think, for every person you meet, how's their day been so far? How's their week been so far? For all I know, they got the worst news in the world yesterday. It can feel exhausting. It's essential for students, and it is beyond a requirement for our disabled students, because a lot of them are dealing with very challenging conditions, but also challenging socioeconomic conditions. There's usually so many different intersecting identities, really. The eye contact point is one that comes up actually frequently enough, and it's something we're trying to work on in our needs assessments, is if students are not comfortable with eye contact, that actually we take the pressure off by not maintaining that rigid eye contact 24/7. We have some students who have learned over the years to push through their discomfort. The discomfort doesn't go away, it never goes away, but they've pushed through it to make me, the person sitting in front of them, comfortable because we make eye contact. Whereas if I find that a student is maybe finding that difficult, I generally just say there's no pressure, or we have boxes of fidget toys, we both use them, for example. But just in case you're sensing that there might be a little bit of tension, sometimes it's nice if you avert your eyes first. Multiple modes of being contacted or communication. We have a lot of students who, I suppose, tell us at the start of the year they might have needed to go to academic registry, for example, for one thing or another. And when they decided to go, it was fine. It was the start of the day. But by the time they're actually able to go, after all these lectures, it's maybe 4 o'clock. Their chronic pain condition is flaring massively. They're so overwhelmed with the degree of work they have to do, and they're facing God knows what at home. So they have said that they've turned up to the desk and then froze, not knowing what to say. And then kind of been told, okay, well, maybe step to the side whilst you think about it. Students have done really well by having like paper to write on, whiteboards to write on. Some of them type on their phone and show that. Other people, I suppose, ask purely, can they talk over email? It is longer. It is a delay. It feels a little bit tedious sometimes. But once again, it's not something that anyone is doing for the fun of it. We're trying to reduce someone's anxiety and up the chances that person's going to get to sleep that night. So that is essentially, I suppose, some of our things our students have said. They've also asked us just to reiterate that sometimes, particularly students who are neurodivergent or have mental health conditions, they learn about masking so young, really. And they learn to cover up showing they're struggling. So a lot of the time we find it in our service, I do it absolutely all the time, where I will say, yeah, that's perfect, and leave, and nothing has happened in my head, because I was so focused on making sure that I looked like someone who was capable. I looked like someone who wasn't going to be disregarded because someone knows my diagnosis. So a lot of the time we do advise students, you can absolutely ask for clarity. We know it ourselves, but I suppose as fellow staff, we're aware of how approachable everyone is. But the students just like us to be aware that maybe they haven't understood everything the first time, even if they're nodding. So I tend to tell the students, I say, I may be repeating myself, because I don't want them to think I'm repeating myself just because I presume they don't understand. But I say, I'm just going to repeat it for myself and yourself, and we both get it through that way. There's a lot of like improved outcomes, I think, on follow-up communication through that. So ableism. Ableism is something that I think gives people the shivers a little bit, because it feels like another word to deal with, another ism, is what we hear a lot. But in reality, it's something that has always been present. I was, getting on the bus last week, and a wheelchair user turned up. The bus driver forgot to put in the ramp. The ramp wasn't there. and we just literally had to leave her. That's been happening for so long. So this isn't a new concept. We just have words to describe pain now, emotional pain that someone experiences, what that woman must have been experiencing when we drove off and she had hoped the next bus was going to have that ramp. So if you see these words and it can feel a little bit, oh God, here's another consideration I have to make. Jesus, okay. Actually, it's already been there, and it's giving the students ways of describing what they experience. And for us, it's really, really helpful actually, because it means that they are coming to us expressing areas that they are being challenged in, maybe where their reasonable accommodations aren't being met. And whereas otherwise they wouldn't have had the word to say, I think that might be ableism, I'm not sure. These aren't massive accusations, these are just us sitting down and saying, okay, maybe that's true actually, okay, let's sit it down and tease it out. So ableism in services, for example, can come in lots of different ways. This happens to all of us, even if we are not disabled. For example, repeated use of demoralizing language. These aren't to say that Trinity services do these, but these are what the students have fed back that they experience when they go to their GP, when they're trying to book a dentist appointment, when they're on the phone to the receptionist, trying to get into the GP, which is kind of harder sometimes. The physical environment of the service can be massively difficult. I personally find lights really, really difficult, and sometimes too low light is a problem. But I have a very difficult time advocating for myself in relation to lights because I feel like such a people pleaser that I don't want to disturb anyone else in the room. That's something I have to work on. It's something we work on directly with our students, that it's a need, that it's okay to ask. Students' attempts to self-advocate, people communicate in different ways. Sometimes that communication can come across as blunt, sharp, ungrateful, different kind of ways, because regardless if a student is reaching out to a staff member, service or academic, they need something, there's a need, so emotions are high. Emotions are high and our students are already in the middle of exams and they don't want another task. It's another task. So emotions are generally running high by the time an email is written. However, it's important to consider that actually, I suppose, looking at beyond how a sentence might be structured in an email and say, what do they really need me to hear? That can be hard and it might take a minute and you might need to not reply immediately. But sometimes it is the student's only way in that moment of saying, I'm in trouble right now. You're my life jacket and I am so used to struggling that I have no faith in you, and it's not personal, but I have no faith. So I'm going to come potentially feeling already defeated, which impacts how we talk to each other. I think when we look at it from that lens, it can feel less like a personal kind of attack from the students. Sharing students' diagnosis without their consent, I think that might be obvious to all of us that that's not acceptable, but it can happen at different points. I think when we've had students, for example, who, I suppose myself again, for example, I am happy to talk about being autistic. I will answer anyone's questions, I don't mind. But if I was meeting somebody new outside of work, I don't know, and I hadn't yet told them, and that opportunity was taken from me, I am so comfortable and so proud to be autistic, but that would still absolutely rock the ground I stand on. So sometimes you can almost do it without thinking because somebody is already confident in how they express it to you. When in doubt, don't. It's kind of the go-to, really. In academia, I suppose we have the disregarding of a student's lens report, so their learning education needs summary. It's essentially our form that has, I suppose, a bullet points of their accommodations, things they need. There's exam accommodations, course accommodations, and then some additional supports that we can offer as a service. Once this is enacted, it gets shared with the academics in the student's life, whoever it's relevant to, and their tutor generally. Often we can have, for example, that a student needs extra time in an exam, and that's fine, they get that extra time, but they also need that extra time every time they have a classroom exam. That's suddenly difficult because a lecturer now maybe has to find a different room, or if it's an online exam, set up a different link. There's more to it there's teasing it out. It's effort, and I get that it's annoying, and I understand for academic staff, it's not just annoying, it's tough, to be honest, to balance everything, but it is going to directly impact someone's lifelong outcomes, their quality of their life. You might think it's one exam, it's one MCQ, it's 15 minutes. If they don't have time that they need, that'll rock their confidence massively. They will never, ever reach out for help again, guaranteed. How they complete their degree has entirely changed. How they enter the working world has entirely changed. All of these things create such small, I suppose, snowball effects that are massive. So once again, maybe zoom out if you can and look beyond. God, it's an MCQ that's it's not even 2%. But actually it's about more than that. It represents someone's ability to show up and say, I deserve to be in the room. Okay, so I suppose the others are kind of similar. We have hosting classes in inaccessible spaces there. Sometimes it's really hard to control the rooms we have. You know, the rooms can be limited, you get assigned them, it's tough. But when we have inaccessible spaces, there might be alternative ways for a student to access that lecture, whether it's online, whether it is approaching estates and facilities and looking to move, going that extra mile. Once again, it is just about, it's about that extra bit of effort, I suppose. And that can be the straw that, you know, broke the camel's back sometimes when you're tired, I understand. But for that student, once again, the ripple effect is phenomenal. Okay, so in terms of accessibility, one thing we do is we run an internship program every summer. And what we're aiming to do this year is the different services that are going to take part, we are going to go into their offices, naturally with their permission, and look at doing an accessibility audit or review. We were asked for this actually by a lot of services who said they kind of looked around their office and they were like, I can tell this isn't accessible, but I can't tell you what needs to change. I can usually tell because typically whether you're disabled or not, there's generally aspects of the office you spend a lot of time in that are not conducive to how you work. Whether it's you find the lights hard and you don't need a diagnosis for that, that can just happen. Or if there's a lot of stairs, you know, and that can be tough different days. But there's different kinds of accessibility that we look at as well, which is worth including, which is our visual accessibility. This can be to do with academic materials, how we present different materials to services, cognitive, mobility, speech. The one that isn't there actually is our sensory accessibility. And I might add that in before I share the slides, but our sensory accessibility is massive. So all of these things sound like we are going to, I suppose, go into every single service, every single classroom. There's going to be 9 different audits, 9 different outcomes, meetings, all of this. So once again, it can feel like it's easier if we just don't even open that door. And I do understand because you feel like you're potentially signing up for a very long project. But in reality, the most changes that we have asked our students that have been impactful, you know, what's made the difference, are instantaneous. Like a lecturer at the start of a lecture saying, are you guys okay with the brightness of my screen? Are you guys okay with the lights being like this? Sometimes it's about modeling it as well. I know with a student, when we have a needs assessment, I do this for myself, but I also do it to model for them. I will say, do you mind if we use the lamp rather than the big light? It can be really hard if you have a lecture hall or, you know, you've got people standing behind you in a queue to advocate for yourself. So typically what we would recommend is maybe following up with students after a very short feedback form that's done twice a year to say, how are you finding the accessibility of the rooms? Are there any quick fixes, things like that, that we can do? Generally, they're very, very small. A lot of them, for example, are even down to the lecturer just needing to speak a bit more slowly. One that comes up quite frequently is needing access to materials beforehand. All of these are inexpensive and easier to do than I think that we look at. Obviously, there's some that might take bigger changes, and that's why we continue to do the full audit, but we can make change today. So these are just some examples, I suppose, of accessibility challenges that the students told us about that they experience. think we've probably all experienced. Like accessing services, long waiting times. This is one that I suppose they generally feel quite terrible about complaining about, because if there's long waiting times, it means there's a long queue, which means the service is busy. So the last thing they need to hear is, I've been standing for 40 minutes, I can't do this. But sometimes it is, once again, a bit make or break, and we need to prioritize those students if they do feel comfortable advocating for themselves. There's only so much that we can do as services. If someone doesn't, tell us that they have a disability, that there's something that we could do to change things in the moment, there's only so much we can do, and we understand that. But if someone does advocate, it can be really good just take a minute to breathe and be like, is there something tangible I could do right now? We have, I suppose, having averse sensory responses to settings. A lot of the students actually mentioned this in relation to when they access services, that sometimes they've come from a lecture and they're maybe, in a queue somewhere, and it's just so overwhelming that by the time they get to the desk, they're like, I come across as so rude. I'm so rude, and I'm agitated, and I just want to leave, and I'm giving very short answers, and I'm really impatient, and all of these kind of things. But in reality, those students, they feel a huge amount of guilt generally after, but it's something that was beyond their control. And whilst that doesn't make it easy to absorb, it means it's a consideration for us to make, to think, maybe it's not about me, maybe it's nothing to do with me, and I did the best I could on my end. So mandatory appointment attendance, same with mandatory lectures. There is a huge fear with our students of, if they miss a lecture, maybe twice in a row because they're sick, quite a few will simply never go back, because the concept of re-entering and facing what they are going to assume is going to be chastisement, some kind of response that's going to be negative, that they don't have the emotional bandwidth to absorb because they're so strained in every other area of their life. Obviously, this has negative academic ramifications going on, and they know this. It's not that there's a lack of logic there, it's that there's an overwhelm that is smothering them, really. So if we have a student who regularly misses appointments with us, for example, we do occupational therapy, and some of our OTs have students that might cancel twice in a row or simply not show up twice in a row. How we follow up with them really matters, because if we follow up with them with a mild tone of accusation of, where were you? We were meant to meet today. I was waiting. And at times that can be tempting, because there's 100 other people that needed that appointment. And I can feel agitated. All of this sounds great, but in reality, in the moment, we all have our moments that we're not proud of. So we do generally try to take time, though, to say, how am I going to phrase this email to them that makes it clear to them that I have not changed my perception of their value as a person. It sounds like a lot, I think, but in reality, I think it's no different than being in the workplace and you receive maybe a progress report, your feedback on how you're doing, performance, and if there is one small thing off in that, it's very hard for me, for example, I was think, oh God, maybe my value has dropped as a worker now, because there was one thing I need to improve on. But actually, it really depends on how it was communicated to me. So that's kind of, I suppose, one thing to look at. Down the bottom, I will say is very important, is we have students who use captioning software at different times. A lot of the times these students might be disabled. They might just be international students who are struggling with the accent of a lecturer. This happens quite a bit. I suppose as Irish people, we speak really fast, maybe don't enunciate really well, and we're not super clear all the time. I think we just have to be open to feedback, to being able to repeat, to being willing to repeat, and being willing to be reminded to slow down, and that it's not indicative of how we teach, how we do our jobs. So in terms of language, I'm just going to touch, I suppose, on the biggest point in all of this is language is a whole other topic, and like Sean said, it's going to be covered next. The biggest thing that you can do when you're talking to a disabled student, there's no real right use of language, because the disabled community is as multifaceted as any other community, so there's difference of opinions. what I would say is, if you have that fear, because I think it can be a little scary, you don't want to misstep, you don't want to insult, you don't want to get it wrong, ask. Just ask. For the students, they tell us that means so much that someone has asked in good faith and said, I'm going to be really honest with you right now. I don't know if what I just said actually was right, or was that actually insulting. The students usually never in their day get an opportunity to advocate for themselves in a way that's so correlated and related to who they are that it can be pretty empowering as a moment. So if you're unsure, ask. If you do feel like you're going to maybe get it wrong again, because it can take time to get into a language use, say that and acknowledge it when you make a mistake, and just say, sorry, I'm still learning on that, and move on with the conversation. The students say they don't mind if there's, someone is using language that they would potentially think is offensive, if the intention behind it was really solid, and that's what matters. So inclusive environments, to look at them, once again, I suppose the main point is ask for student feedback. How are they finding the space they're in? What I would say is, like with number 2, similar to that modeling idea, is if you are comfortable in your environment and you are doing what you need to take care of yourself, disabled or not, whether that's having a certain type of seat or in the middle of a conversation saying, do you mind if I actually just get my scarf, I'm really cold? Modeling that it's okay to disrupt the energy of a room for the sake of personal comfort, because it is. And it's so important that these students know that, but so many come in and they hold themselves so tightly. And then as they're leaving, I can see that actually they were cold the whole time, or I know the chair they're on they're not comfortable with that. So I have to advocate for myself in front of them. Really, it's just all about that communication base. So this is a student story that we came up, and we're just going to read it, I suppose, together. But I'll read it for you guys. But this student she's not real, but it is based on quite a few of our different stories, and particularly that piece around students who have more than one disability, and how much they want students or staff to understand what it took for them to turn up. So we called her Salma. So we're going to go through her day. We're going to look at her morning, her afternoon, her evening briefly. We're not going to do anything with this. It's just to let it sit with you that there is a huge percentage of the population of students in Trinity where this could be a mild version of what's going on. So Salma is a first-year nursing student at TCD, who's navigating her first semester as an autistic woman with a neurological condition that limits her mobility. Salma's lectures begin early, and despite not being able to sleep due to chronic pain, she gets up early. She needs to take public transport before rush hour to avoid the sensory overwhelm of the crowds, otherwise she'll feel sick and anxious all day. Arriving on campus early in the morning, Salma needs to sit for a long time before her first lecture to allow her blood pressure to normalise. It's not yet 9 a.m. and her bones are aching. She is also uncomfortable because she realises in her rush to leave the house, she put her socks on inside out. The sensory feeling of the seam on her feet is physically painful, but Salma doesn't want to seem weird by taking off her shoes and her socks in public, and the bathroom is too far of a walk away. She meets her friends for their first lecture and smiles. They don't know that she is struggling. They want her to come on a night out. After all, they'll never be first years again. After 3 lectures back to back, Salma's fatigued. She had to walk across campus rapidly to get to a lecture in the 5-minute break between classes, but the speed caused her blood pressure to drop, and now she's nauseous. Telling her friends that she will catch up with them in the library later, she goes to the nearest bathroom. Sitting on the floor of the cubicle, Salma cries. Salma takes out her phone and considers texting her mother that she's crying, but she knows that her mother, along with her doctors, will suggest again that she defer her place at Trinity. They will ask her how she ever expects to survive in the real world, and Salma wants nothing more than to be a nurse. After an hour on the ground, Salma gets up to go to another lecture. It's mandatory attendance, and the lecturer does not believe in recording the lectures. Salma cannot focus, however. There's a fluorescent light overhead that's blinking, and the sight is physically painful. It's so sharp that it feels like spears behind her eyes. I don't want to get too much feedback. Okay. After their last lecture, Salma's friends want to go grab a coffee before heading to the library. Salma runs through the consequences of joining them in her mind. Coffee makes her blood pressure unstable. Her friends love a coffee shop that's small and filled with strong scents. And the last time Salma was there, she had a panic attack because a baby didn't stop crying. Socializing will take from her energy reserves, and she still needs to make the hour-long commute home. Salma apologizes and excuses herself, heading to the Lewis stop. At this point, the straps of her bag are sending sharp shooting pains to the top of her spine to her toes, and that makes her uneven on her feet. She stumbles into someone as she gets on the Lewis and is called a racial slur. The word hits Salma and freezes her as all the other passengers look away awkwardly. She gets on the Lewis and gets a seat, but an older woman asks her to give it up. Salma doesn't feel like she can refuse. On the outside, she looks young and healthy. As a result, when she gets home, she has to wait a while before making it upstairs. She does not get deep sleep that night. So, the reality is, after that, I feel exhausted reading it. And I think I was that student, I was Salma. It's a tremendously difficult experience to get out of bed every day and face this. And if you're doing it, it's because you love what you're doing. It's because you have no alternative. My parents, for example, and the doctors, they told me, would you just defer for another year? But I had no end in sight for my health condition. I had no end in sight what was going to be different next year, so the struggle is the same. A lot of our students have that attitude, and I can fully empathize with them, to be honest. They maybe love what they do, and yet they don't have a plan for the future. They don't know how they're going to do it. That's not what we have to care about. We have to care about getting them through today, making sure today is not as painful as it could be, that they meet someone that's kind once, that they walk away thinking that Trinity staff are approachable and that they can approach them and they will in the future. We don't have a responsibility to take on all of this emotion, all of this difficulty that they're showing up with, but we do have a responsibility to monitor our interaction. So I just want to touch really briefly, I think it's only on 2 slides, on responding to disclosure. Just because I think having disclosed a disability, sometimes people don't know what to say in response. Once again, I think it comes from that component of people not wanting to say the wrong thing. They want to be sensitive. They want to maybe not seem ignorant about a condition. I've certainly done that, where someone might tell me, for example, a student might tell me that they have type 1 diabetes, and I realise how little I know about that. And at the start, I might have tried to pretend, but now I'm just like, great. Is there anything you think I really need to know? Or anything you think I should research, or anything you really think we should actually be aware of as a team? Really, your role in a disability disclosure of any kind is just listen. Just be nice and listen. When you are disabled, it can be very difficult, I suppose, when you do state that you're disabled, because you start to preempt this but. It's coming. Even if someone doesn't say it, you can see it in their face. They're thinking, like, for example, and countless times, if not every single time I have disclosed being autistic to a family member, I've been told, oh, but you're so successful. Oh, but you don't really look it. Various forms in that. Once again, the intention is there. It's so good. It's loving. It's a gut punch all the same. So now I've learned that I leave this little pause when I tell people, and because I'm waiting for them to get their discreditation of me out of the way slightly. And I think it can be really impactful if we don't do that. And we just pause, just listen. It's also good to give the students the opportunity to say, you don't have to tell me everything about it right now. Sometimes it's just stating it, putting it in the playing field. That's a lot. So if you just say, we can come back around to it if you ever want to talk to it, feel like you can come back in, whatever it is, the door is open. Sometimes they won't come back, they won't need to, but the fact that the door was open meant they stayed registered in college. They stayed feeling like they could come in because this was a place where they were accepted. So that's essentially what these slides do as well. I just wanted to make sure I had them written down when I'm sharing them with people afterwards. After a disclosure, I think if you don't know what to do as a follow-up, potentially, as academic staff, if a student's coming to you and saying, oh, the dissertation is coming up and I am doing really well on it, but there's no way I'm going to make the deadline. I need an extra few days. Can I get an extension? And then they tell you they have a disability. They mightn't be registered with us. It takes a lot for the students to actually come to us, because I think it means aligning yourself with the word disability. And that can be really difficult. Most of the students do tell us that actually they realized it didn't matter at all. But once again, it's that first step. Sometimes the best thing you can do is just ask, what would you like to happen next? You can always reach out to us in the disability service as well and say, do you mind actually if I just check in with disability about what's actually even available, or what we can do, or can I offer an alternative means of assessment, or should I change my materials? Whatever it is, you can always reach out to us at askds@tcd.ie. But a lot of the time, it's really nice to be student-led where possible. They might have any suggestions for you. They might need to go away and think about it. They might need a small nudge, but once it happens with one student and then happens with another, I think you'll gain a bit of confidence in saying, thank you for telling me. What do you think we can do going forward to help you? And be fully aware and free to say, I do it all the time, where I tell students, I know nothing about this. I'm not going to pretend I'm at a position of seat of knowledge about every neurological condition in existence. So I will say, I'm sorry if I'm asking a lot of questions. Students, once again, it's that good faith bit, turning up in good faith. So I think, oh yeah, this is just reflecting, I suppose, on your practices. It's just kind of, I suppose, summarize what we've been talking about, is putting yourself in the shoes of the student. Sounds good, and it is what we should be doing, but it can be really difficult when their lives feel so distant from us. I'm only graduated from college 7 years, I think, and that feels like another planet. That's not a thing that happened. I feel like very, very different to the students that come into me. But instead, I asked myself, generally, how would a compassionate person respond? That's it. I don't judge myself for maybe needing that prompt, because if I'm tired, I'm having a difficult day, I can be very, almost a bit deadpan and exhausted. But once I ask myself, how would a compassionate person respond, it recenters me with the best interest of the student in mind. So sometimes it can be just have a little prompt like that for yourself. And I think that's it. Yeah, there we go. Don't know how we did time-wise. That's not bad.
Okay, so yeah, thanks, Jen. If anybody has any questions, either here in person or online, if anyone has a question online, you can either put it on the chat or just unmute yourself.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm not the question staff, I am the contact for lens reports for our post-grad.
Oh, great, okay.
So I pass them on obviously to the moderators, course director, and the dissertation. And should I take any action? Like, I presume I've never acknowledged that I have them unless I get an extension request and pass it on. Should I be more proactive? Or is that kind of almost like, is that what maybe?
No, that's a totally fair question. That's a totally fair question. Is the mic on, or will I repeat the question? Yeah, so just in case anyone online couldn't hear, the question there, I suppose, is that we have somebody here at the talk who receives lens reports. When we get a lens report and we do it with a student, we sign off, we explain to them that this doesn't suddenly go to every lecture they've ever had. That can be a big panic, especially those students who are going on medical placement. They can feel very much like, this is going to be on my record now, that I've got issues, is what they tend to say. But it does go to generally a center point in a department, and that then gets disseminated to who it's relevant to. And the question really was asking if you should do some kind of follow-up or acknowledge that you've received a lens. Ultimately, absolutely not. You're fine. You've done everything right. We brief the students very closely on what will happen. What we've noticed as well with the students is sometimes coming in to do the lens report and the needs assessment was so exhausting for them that as little acknowledgement past that is best. If you do have a question about a lens or anything like that you've received and you're thinking, oh God, I don't know who I go to, just talk to the disability service about it. And we tend to keep all of our communication with students very much, they're adults, they need to be involved in the conversation. We don't talk about them without them. So if it's necessary, we'll absolutely CC them in and just say, we're just clarifying this question on a lens. But otherwise, absolutely not. You've done everything, really.
Any questions online? So just finally, if there's any final questions from anyone online, if not, we can wrap it up there.
Can I ask one more?
Oh, go for it. Fine.
If, say, for example, this is probably a very individual question,
okay.
but if you know that a student through their undergraduate education probably was registered with disability service there, they haven't done it with us, how can you tease that without
Yeah, that's
because it is actually quite a serious thing for them and we're trying to do it for the better, but we just don't know how we can tease that.
Yeah, absolutely. It is very difficult, and it's interesting because we do have quite a few students that we find out have become postgrads but haven't re-registered, or register maybe towards the very end of a postgrad or something like that, and the academic staff are really at a limit of what they can do. Some of those late students, I suppose, that register do tell us that they didn't register initially for a few reasons. Obviously, everyone has individual reasons, but one being, for example, they thought, I'm doing a postgrad now. I've got it together, I'm an adult. I don't need that. It won't be as intense as an undergrad. I'm getting treatment now for whatever condition it is. So actually, I'm in a better position. So there can be a lot of different reasons that ultimately the student mightn't discover until well into semester one that actually there was a need there all along. So it can be hard to broach it. I think if you're interacting with them directly, as you know, in whatever way, whether you're a supervisor or whatever it might be, or a lecturer, and potentially you had that relationship in undergrad. If you knew them in undergrad, I think it's okay to raise it. The students tend to like continuous conversation, because if you knew that information, you can always say, do you mind if we just have a chat? This isn't me accusing you of struggling at all whatsoever. It's just to say, I know that the registration process with the disability service can take a while, and I wasn't sure if that's something that you needed raised again. The students generally take that really well. The process can take a while, so that is a fair point to make. If you were not their direct contact in undergrad and you've heard from another staff member that they were registered, I wouldn't say it's fair to raise it, generally, which is very, very difficult, but it's about that consent issue. The students are exceptionally sensitive to sharing their diagnoses, which is entirely fair. Also, a lot of them are coming from different cultures where there's different perceptions and receptions as well. But if it was you that knew it, I think you could always say an offer, because they might be so frozen and overworked that they're going, you're asking me to do another thing, But actually, what might be really helpful is if you say, I might actually just email the general disability service email and ask, does a student have to fully re-register, or what's the process there? Would you like me to do that? And you can give that a go. If they would like, they don't have to register with us to meet with us one-on-one. If they want to talk about if they would benefit from registering, they can do that, absolutely. But if you do feel like you have that relationship with it, I know I've had positive experiences with students in the past where I have raised it, and my heart's been going out my chest slightly, thinking, have I crossed the line here? But actually, sometimes it's the students themselves. They thought there was a perception they should be coping, so they're not going to raise it. So it can be really important. Once again, it's maybe modeling as well. I think for me, it doesn't mean I should share absolutely everything about my diagnostic journey, but it's okay for me to say, I was on my knees throughout third year and final year of my undergrad and it wasn't pretty. I'm here now, but it was not pretty. And I definitely needed help. I need them to understand that no one has it fully together, including the person in front of them. So I would say go on a one-by-one basis, but with your relationship with them, to be honest. But if you do have any general questions and you don't share, the student's name and all of that, absolutely email us with them. And we can maybe advise and help there. We just ask that you wouldn't share that person's personal details until they were part of the conversation. No problem.
We're over time now. Okay, so thank you everybody for attending today's session. As I mentioned at the start, I will follow up with everyone who was registered with the slides and the link to the recording too. Don't forget to register for our next session on the 27th, 4 to 5 p.m. on inclusive language. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Yes.